Welcome to the United Nations Development Programme session of Stockholm Climate Week today. As most of the world discusses the urgency of the energy crisis and how we can transition to sustainable energy, Ukraine is facing a crisis that is critical to survival. The priority is to keep the light and heat flowing, but at the same time, it is also looking at laying the groundwork for a more sustainable and resilient energy infrastructure. Today, we have with us Jaco Cilliers, the resident representative of UNDP Ukraine, who's going to be sharing with us current experience and insights to energy security in Ukraine. So Jaco, there you are, wonderful. So please, first of all, introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work that you do for UNDP.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and it's really a great privilege to be here at this very important event. As you mentioned, I'm the resident representative of UNDP in Ukraine. I lead a wonderful and a strong team, mostly Ukrainians, that come to work determined to change the lives of their people for the better. So we have a staff of about 400 people on the ground here that work in communities throughout Ukraine, in every single region or oblast, as we call them here, dedicated to doing different things. And we've been in Ukraine since 1993. We've worked on many development challenges, including working with the government, working with civil society, working with private sector, on anything from good governance initiatives, economic growth. We also help with job creation. But we've also worked on protecting the environment and working on climate change related issues for the government. But as you can imagine, since February 2022, everything has really been turned upside down in Ukraine with the Russian invasion and the war that broke out in Ukraine. So just to give you a little bit of numbers of what we're dealing with here in Ukraine, we have about 7.1 million people that have moved back into poverty after the war broke out. And this is just in 14 months since the war happened. We've estimated that about 15 years of development gains have been wiped out in the last 14 months. And we recently did, together with the World Bank and the European Union, what we call a rapid damage needs assessment. And this estimated that the damages since the war broke out is in the region of $411 billion. So you can imagine really astronomical damages. The country is really dealing with a lot of challenges. And what we are then trying to do in UNDP is work in 4 areas. We try to sustain public services. So we help with schools and hospital restorations, bringing kids back and helping making sure that people have healthcare. We try to boost economic services, so we create jobs and help businesses reestablish themselves. And then we work also on demining. As you can imagine, it's very dangerous for people to come back. A lot of war ordinances or ammunitions are lying around. Kids can play with that, and people want to return to their houses. Farmers want to go back to sowing seeds and planting crops, but there's also often a lot of dangers there for them. And lastly, we restore the energy infrastructure, which is part of what we will talk about further today.
Thank you very much, Jaco. So how many people would you say are affected by the damages done to the energy infrastructure?
Well, the numbers are really astronomical in terms of what has happened. We did recently, and we just completed a study that was done with the World Bank. And it estimated that about 61% of the capacity that have been generated in Ukraine have been damaged or totally destroyed. About 22 out of every 36 power stations, or the 36 power stations in Ukraine, have either been totally destroyed or damaged. So what it meant is that about 12 million people have had very limited or no access to energy during, specifically since October when these attacks started, but since the beginning of the war as well, because the energy infrastructure have been damaged a lot since the war started. You can imagine, and I was here during the winter period of time, that was not a happy period for people. We didn't have lights. We didn't have energy to heat ourselves. We didn't have the opportunity to sometimes just do the basic things that we take for granted when we have electricity, charging our phones, just boiling some water for tea or coffee. Those were all things that people for hours and sometimes for days did not have access to and could not do. And I think the hardest part of all of this is, when one look at what happened with these attacks, is that it was not just power cuts that affected people, but it really that connections with people were also lost. People had to flee to bunkers to protect themselves, and connections with people and just having solidarity with people around you was something that was missing during the winter. Things are luckily starting to improve, and we see significant improvements since the end of winter, and with the incredible work that the government and also Ukrenegro, which is the electricity companies, have done here in Ukraine. Those are just incredible, and the people are daily heroes for me every day for going and continuing to try to restore the energy grids and the energy infrastructure.
So how can you work with restoring the energy infrastructure during the war? Because there is still lots of shelling, et cetera, in many areas.
Yeah, so it is really very challenging. These damages, which we mentioned, is about of about $10 billion to the energy infrastructure. Most of those are actually not in the war-affected areas. Most of those have been targeted through drones and through missiles. Targeted drones, I can tell you, we've been to some of these infrastructure facilities. They have been hit exactly at the point where the most critical energy generation is happening. So it becomes very, very difficult during the war to continue to restore these damages on a day-to-day basis. But what we've seen is that the international community has actually done an incredible job in moving forward and actually really contributing to restoring these energy damages. We, for instance, in UNDP get money from Japan, from Iceland, from Sweden, from the European Union, from Norway, just to mention a few countries. And there are plenty of donors who are contributing to helping Ukraine here. And what we see is even in the war-affected areas, anywhere from Kherson to Kharkiv, to the areas that's really on the front line, that people are able to start restoring and start to see the electricity and lights return to their communities, which is really encouraging. So we estimate that in the next 6 months, or before the next winter starts, that there's critical needs of about $1.5 billion worth of investments that needs to be invested in, specifically in the energy infrastructure.
So, Jaco, when you do all this work, how is the focus on the green recovery? I mean, green energy and facilitating this transition while you're amending the system?
Yeah, throughout, and I think they always say there's a light at the end of the tunnel, or there's hope for people. The sad part is obviously with the damages and the suffering that people have had to go through with these attacks. But at the same time, as Ukrainians would tell you, this is also creating new opportunities for them. They are starting to look at rebuilding their energy infrastructure in a renewed way and a renew way. So they're looking at renewable energies, they're looking at wind, they're looking at solar. They're also looking at how to while they're rebuilding, reducing their dependence on coal and gas, to make sure that they can also invest in new forms of energy efficiency. And they're also looking at new decentralized power generation. So at the same time, while there's a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty of just keeping the lights on and keeping energy flowing in the country, there's also a renewed effort to think, how can we do it better, and in some ways build back better, but also build back greener.
Well, thank you very much, Jaco. And if you're watching this and you want to contribute, how do you contribute?
Well, I think there's various ways. The solidarity with Ukrainians throughout the world is actually incredible. I would say that, there's various ways that you can donate. Part of it would be through UNDP, because we do a lot of work, but there's also a lot of UN agencies, including NGOs, that do incredible work here on the ground. I would say find out who is reputable, which organizations you can support through whichever country you're watching this from, and contribute, because the people in Ukraine need it. Let me just say, I have never come across a nation that is so resilient and so determined to overcome the challenges they face. It is really empowering. It is really, every day I get inspired by what Ukrainians are doing, and please continue to help and support.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights, Jaco. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
So there is definitely a lot of work that needs to be done for us to have a sustainable future, but how do we create a global awareness? We'll start by watching a very successful campaign. It's a video that has so far had more than 2.2 billion viewers. So please watch this.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Well, it's a fabulous video, isn't it? So now let's meet some of the brains and hearts behind this UNDP campaign, Don't Choose Extinction. So please let me welcome on stage, we have Boaz Paddy, Chief Creative Officer at UNDP. Please give him a warm hand. It's a fantastic campaign.
Thank you.
And also joining us here in the studio is Vic Tobo-Carlson. He's a serial entrepreneur gone green. His company, Global Mindpool, yes please, is behind the Don't Choose Extinction AI. It's an AI-powered platform designed to harness collective intelligence. And with us on Zoom, we should be joined, yes, there you are. Nick Garrett was a senior creative consultant in the creation of the campaign. And you have 24 years of industry experience leading some of the most creative companies in the world. And you joined Deloitte Digital Creative as a partner in September 2021. So, yes, absolutely. So, all of you here, all three of you, had a big part to play in this creation of this fantastic campaign. And, well, it's important for us to sort of grasp that it's a huge endeavor you started here. So, Boaz, please tell us about the campaign, how it started, and what was the purpose of starting it.
Sure, thank you. It's wonderful to be here again. In about January 2020, so just a few weeks before, in the before times, I had an office retreat with a number of policy folks at UNDP, And one of the policy folks at the UNDP was the head of nature, environment, and climate. And I asked him, we were talking about campaigning and what campaign we could do. And I bluntly asked him, if you had one issue that you needed to campaign about before you did anything else, the first step, what would that be? And he said, we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And frankly, I didn't know what it was, so I had to get out my Google and check. And that was very telling, because I had no idea what fossil fuel subsidies were. I'd never heard of them before, nor did I know that my tax dollars are actually paying for them. Diving deeper into the issue in the coming hours in that retreat, I discovered gradually the absurdity of the situation, the enormity of the problem, and that the fact that it actually is, us in a way destroying ourselves by paying for it. We're actually paying subsidies to fossil fuel companies to pull oil out of the earth and pollute the earth and destroy the earth. And we are doing that with our own tax money. Of course, it's not up to us, it's up to policymakers. But it still seems so absurd. So we decided to do the campaign about it. The other part of it is like, if, last year, to 2022, $700,000 was used in fossil fuel subsidies around the world. It actually went up in 1 year. It went up from the year before, from 423 to 700. That's because of the Ukraine war that we just heard about, and various other economic factors. But so we have $700 billion spent last year on fossil fuel subsidies. So if you stop to imagine what you could have as positive income from $700 billion, it's enormous. You could create a universal basic income and give people the ability to kind of get the money themselves rather than fossil fuel companies getting the money. Because if we took away fossil fuel subsidies, the first thing that would happen is that the fuel prices would rise. But if the government gave you money instead, you wouldn't feel it. It would be a zero-sum game. So, but actually it could help alleviate poverty. It would lower inequalities. It could create girls' education. It could create green jobs and green tech. So we decided to try and match up the two. We would take away from here and we would put it here. It seems like a simple solution, but we needed to explain that to everyone, not to policymakers necessarily. I mean, yes, to policymakers, but we wanted to explain it to everyone in the world. We wanted this to be a message that could be heard across the world. And that's where the problem was. And that's where the power of creativity comes in and essentially to the rescue. Of course, with my dear friend Nick Garrett, who was absolutely pivotal in that moment where we needed to explain a very complicated issue in a very, very simple way.
So, Boaz, could you please tell us a bit, how has this campaign inspired companies, organizations, or people? Do you have any great examples? I'm sure you do.
I mean, it has all across the world. We see, first of all, the first thing that happened that in COP26, that was 2 COPs ago. We had me and you were together in COP27, but before that, in Glasgow, fossil fuel subsidies had never been on the COP agenda. Like it just wasn't ever mentioned. And not necessarily only because of this campaign, but certainly it had impact. Fossil fuel subsidies became part of the COP agenda. So now negotiators have to negotiate about it. We have to talk about it. We have to talk about it openly. That's one big thing that happened. And that's a big global thing that happened. But we are also seeing increasingly that policymakers around the world are willing to have a conversation about it. They're willing to contemplate the idea of lowering fossil fuel subsidies. Now, if you lower fossil fuel subsidies without the transactional return of giving something back to people, what happens is that we get situations like the yellow vests in France and various other. So there's civil disorder, there's mass riots, and we want to avoid that, and we want to leave no one behind. But if there is a way for us to kind of repurpose those funds for a positive use, then there is a way forward, and then it becomes a choice. And so lots of countries are approaching UNDP and asking us to help them through that transition. And just to be clear, this has to be the first step in the green transition, because the fossil fuel subsidies skew the economy. They skew it towards fossil fuels and make renewables seem more expensive.
It's not a level playing field.
It's not a level playing field. So it's a very, very important first step, and we're definitely seeing movement in that direction now.
Excellent. Turning to Nick now, you obviously have a long track record and strong track record in the creative business here, and you've been instrumental in this process of this campaign. So could you please tell us a bit about storytelling, the importance of and the power of storytelling and related to this process here?
Me today. Lovely to be there with Mick and Boaz. Storytelling isn't a new thing. It's obviously a skill and an art that's been going on for millennia. And the art of storytelling can sometimes look simple, but of course, there's a huge amount of science, communication science, and rigor behind it. And I'll go into that in a minute. The greater the challenge, the greater the art of storytelling. And let's look at it as creativity. If we can be interesting to deliver a vital message, we have to deliver that message in an extraordinarily interesting way. And I'm sort of going to regress back into maybe some marketing science here. Everything is dependent on one key thing. So it's three filters. First of all, it's cut through. Then we've got comprehension. Then we call it likability, but let's say it's engagement. If we can't get to that engagement piece, and that engagement piece isn't tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or billions in this case, then we can't genuinely trigger behavior change. And I'm going to talk about behavior change in a second. So the cut-through piece is absolutely vital. Having a dinosaur standing on stage at the UN delivering a message is going to get cut through. So we have a vehicle to take everyone's attention. But cut-through alone doesn't count for anything in storytelling. It's a starting point and it opens the funnel. Cut-through then leads to comprehension. Do I understand the message that is being delivered? So that art of delivering quite a challenging message in a challenging category at a challenging time. And Boaz might go into more detail about the consumer engagement model and the segmentation we looked at. But we're not talking to the no's and the hard yeses. We're talking to the 2.7 or 3.2 billion people in the middle who are sitting on that fence. So to land that succinct, single-minded proposition and message right there, to deliver that comprehension, to remove doubt, to remove questions, again, there's an art in it. And finally, that final piece of stickiness and engagement. So they're the three vital tenets of powerful storytelling. We get to the actual story, and particularly in behavior change, it's a reductionist thinking so that you reduce to the simplest, easiest statement. And that statement needs to be something that billions of people are saying yes to, because no one will refute it. And in this case, don't choose extinction. When you have those lines, and I remember the team presenting it to Boaz before we got into all the script, you can see his eyes light up immediately, because that don't choose extinction, I'm pretty sure there's no one on the planet that would be choosing extinction in a simple, classic, rational way. So that's a platform everyone's saying yes to. And then you build it up, build it up, build it up. So is my piece of creative storytelling differentiated? Yes. Am I relevant? Yes. And is it a sustainable message that's powerful and connects? And I think the art of modern storytelling, and this is where Mick and his team came in and did such an extraordinary job. At the heart of great ideas, there's an experience. And in that experience, you're then driving people into an ecosystem that is sticky, engaging, and you're giving them the tools to act on themselves. And in our instance, it was a fact-based conversation. So instead of getting people to say, I think about X, it's I know this. And that is the piece. Great storytelling to drag you in, to get your attention, and then bring them into an ecosystem with wonderful tools, assets, information to be able to either contribute through Mindpool or to be able to arm themselves with the facts, to be able to have robust conversations in the real world.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. So over to you. Your company obviously played a pivotal role also in this transition here, this transformation, this delivering of this message. So you created the website, which aim to engage, of course, pull in people and make them act. Why is it so important, do you think, to engage, involve ordinary citizens in this transformation? And how did you play this out? How did it play out for you?
Yeah, I think it's very important for all of us to be able to engage. I think we can walk around with our political views and all kinds of things, but if we aren't engaging, we don't take it in fully. It doesn't become a part of us. So I think it was very important to get people committed to doing something. That also means that you play a more active role and you become a better ambassador towards your friends and parents or whatever. So the active element of it was very important. The thing is, when you, as we've heard before, I think Sarah Hunter mentioned it, that everything is aligned. We are all, the politicians, the entrepreneurs, everybody agrees what we're going to do, but it's just not going fast enough. So we need to keep pushing, and that's what we can do by engaging civilians, normal people. We need people to understand that they need to vote. This needs to be more important than immigration or pension or whatever. There are many important issues in politics, but this is a threat to our children's future. And if we get inside people's heads and inside their actions, there's a small hope that they can push politicians to make the necessary and often unpleasant decisions, very expensive decisions. But it needs to be done because all of a sudden we're all Ukraine in a certain situation. So we need to do something, and activating people is a good way of getting them involved.
So Mick, you've been using AI to collect the data and to power this transformation. So how has people responded? How has this been used, the platform, the website?
We're not necessarily using AI to collect the data. We're using the campaign to collect the data. So the main issue for anyone who's interested in data is to get a lot of it, and for that you need a large campaign or a lot of money. But we use AI to look at the data and to find out the interesting parts of the data. And all the data goes to the UNDP to help them with various issues. In this case, the first part of the campaign was fossil fuel subsidies. But the idea about the global mine pool is that it can be sort of an evergreen platform where UNDP can ask questions and get sort of on-the-fly input to whatever thing they're interested in.
So Boaz, over to you. How have you been using the input from the global mine pool?
UNDP's main partners and clients, in a way, are governments around the world. Those are the people we speak to. We speak to policymakers. We have a program called the Climate Promise that helps 105 countries with their NDCs, with their nationally determined contributions to the climate agreement. We have massive amount of work in climate and in climate adaptation and mitigation. So for us, that network exists. If we can take to that network new data that shows that if you take bold decisions, there will not be riots in your streets, then it makes it easier for those policymakers to move forward. It makes it simpler for them to understand that they might get reelected again, that they're not going to face extinction themselves in the political sense. And so that's what we want to do with this kind of data. We want to take it back to policymakers. We want to be able to say, hey, here is an option. We're not telling you what to do, but we're telling you that if you follow this path, if you choose the path of really moving towards this transition away from fossil fuels and moving towards renewables, it's possible. And a first step would be to phase out these very, very dangerous subsidies.
And Boaz, the response from political leaders across the world?
I think it's been positive overall. I think it's been overwhelmingly positive. I think while we were building the campaign, of course, UNDP is an organization that works with governments. We receive most of our funds from government, and there was a worry in UNDP that we would governments might become angry at us.
It's a bit unorthodox, yes.
And so we built a heat map of where this could be a real issue. And what happened was, bizarrely enough, that where we built the heat map almost exactly mirrored where the film became most viral. So places like Saudi Arabia, places like India, places like Nigeria. The film was a huge success there. And we were,
What does this tell you?
It tells us that, people are ready for change. People want action. People want bold action. And people want acceleration. Everyone today has been talking about that acceleration. And yes, the technology exists, the possibilities exist. We can reduce fossil fuel subsidies. We can reduce fossil fuels. We can transition. We can decarbonize. We can electrify. And we are doing that, but we need to do it faster, and that's what people want.
Thank you, Boas. So, Nick, the role that the creative community can play in this transition, you obviously made a great contribution here, but in general, creative people watching this, how can they step up and step into the game?
I think the creative community has a level of generosity and ambition that's extraordinary. So I think we've got no shortage of amazing creative people. When I say creative people, not just storytellers of any different definition that comes from a science, art, engineering background. I think the real opportunity is being able to connect them with organizations and individuals like the UNDP or BOAS that have got the science and the rigor. So instead of being in a world where the creative industry often talks about, I think, it's being able to back that up substantially with I know. And when you have sticky creative ideas backed up with hard data and fact, you've got sort of the magic place. I think the art of storytelling and the opportunity for creativity is simple, because there's a danger if that energy is redirected in the wrong place, it doesn't actually help. So to be creative, you have to be simple. It's the reductionist thinking, tell the story that needs to be told, not the story you think you're doing. To Boas and I have been talking about this for a long time, but it's injecting a sense of optimism in there. Shock and awe, doom, negativity. There are lots of things to be negative in the world, but if we don't create a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, and a sense of opportunity. So yes, we have to be there's problem design and creativity, but the art of great creativity is opening your mind up to solution design and the opportunity to change. So I think it's so clear that the creative community and the creative community supported by corporate sector, the public sector, has so much more room. I think the last piece is connectivity. It's the creative community to connect and amplify some core messages versus having contradictory messages and all ladder up to some extraordinary, to build some extraordinary momentum of clear, simple, powerful, engaging platforms. Then there is a huge opportunity to cut through and lead to systemic change.
Thank you, Nick. So, Mick, how do you regard your role and maybe other people or companies like yours in this transition?
I think that I'm an entrepreneur. I've done a little over 20 companies. I think for me, it's very obvious that this is the only thing that makes sense, because having spoken to all the wonderful people of UNDP for so many years, I've sort of got an insight to what the world looks like in 20 years, and it's super scary. And I find it so weird that we are doing these conferences, people are meeting, politicians are meeting, they're traveling around the world, and we're talking about that we should do something, but it's happening so insanely slowly. And then all of a sudden it hits. Somebody's cousin dies from a flooding or whatever that is sort of in our world, because if you're in Pakistan, it's very much in your world right now. But at some point it'll come to here, and then we'll realize that all these small talks, and we want to create this idea, or we have this business we want to make, and as in 5 to 10 years we can become this and that. Well, maybe in 5 to 10 years the world looks very, very different. And I have this example. I'm sure that before the invasion of Ukraine, they had conversations about the library budgets and boring stuff like that in Ukraine. And then the week after, they were all at the front with a gun in their hand. So nobody thought about making money or creative ideas or anything. Then they were fighting for their lives. And I think we can come in a very similar situation. Maybe not you and I, but at least our children can come in a situation where people die left, right, and center, and that's insanely scary. So for me, it's the only thing that makes sense. And I think a good thing is that this is also where the world focuses, so you can actually build businesses in this field. But first of all, we should have another another line item in our spreadsheet that wasn't how much money we're making, but actually what can we do to avoid the situation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Boaz, Mick, and Nick.
If I can just, before we go, I just want to give a shout out to the creative directors of the campaign, because we talked a lot about the creativity, and Nick was our chief creative consultant for the campaign. But we brought on
Shout out to Nick.
shout out to Nick, of course, but also shout out to this incredible company called Activista out of Los Angeles, Paco and Beto, who are our dear friends and our collaborators who came up with the idea of the dinosaur. So just a big shout out to them.
Of course, they need to be mentioned, absolutely. So thank you so much, Nick, for joining, and Mick and Boaz. But stay put, because I've heard in my ear that we have a special guest that might be arriving any second here. So we'll just stay put.
Let's stay put. It's also...
So Frankie, welcome to Stockholm Climate Week. Yes, it makes all the sense in the world that you are here. So how does it feel to be with us here in Stockholm? We have an interpreter here. Yeah.
Yes, so I'm going to be translating dino to English today. So Frankie, what did you say again? Of course, Frankie is extremely honored to be invited to the first Climate Week in Stockholm, and very, very happy also to see that there's so many people who are concerned about the planet and want to take action during this climate crisis.
So Frankie, I'm curious, you were probably listening in on this panel. What would you say about the content? Okay.
Well, Frankie has a very, very special affinity to the little group here. You know, when Frankie went to sleep, had a little siesta in his cave like 17 million years ago, he lost all his family, all his friends, like everybody. So these are his closest friends. And so he's very, very proud to be part of this movement to try and save the planet. Since then, Frankie has also made a lot of new friends traveling around the world. Yeah. Whom he absolutely adores, and he does not want to lose them all over again. So basically, yeah, Frankie, that's why Frankie is very, very much part of this movement and wants to be out there and try and, you know, get people out there to take action.
Well, thank you so much for your hard work, Frankie, and thanks for bringing this topic really to the full focus of our attention. Thanks so much.
Frankie? Save yourselves now. Don't choose extinction.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frankie.
Global viewers, thank you so much for your patience as we kick off part 2 of our Global Earth Day broadcast. I'm thrilled to have in studio with us today Kathleen Rogers, president of earthday.org. Kathleen, thank you for being here. Tell us just a little bit about what it means for Earth Day today as it relates to Ukraine.
Well, we've had a long relationship with Ukraine going back decades. We have many NGOs that we work with. Our feelings and the extraordinary effort that Ukrainians have made to clean up the environment over the last 18 years has just been such a rewarding experience to watch in such a great country. We are particularly pleased that we were able to bring the Deputy Environmental Minister, Irina Sobchak, here with us. Thank you so much for making your time for us and for the panel that will address this incredibly difficult issue, which is environmental crimes that are now occurring every minute in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the Russian military has fired more than 2,000 missiles into Ukraine. Around 85,000 tons of destroyed Russian military equipment is laying in sites and countryside. According to the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, about 300,000 square kilometers of Ukraine's territory need demining, including explosives installed by Russian troops in forests and on vast areas of arable land in Ukraine, which as a result cannot be used for agriculture. Dozens of Ukrainian nature reserves and national parks have suffered significant damage, such as the destruction of Ramsar sites at the coast of the Azov and Black Seas and in the lower reaches of the Danube and the Dnipro rivers. The Russian military has caused significant damage to water supply, sewerage, and communication systems, directly threatening fresh water supplies. UNICEF in Ukraine estimates that up to 6 million people now have no regular access to drinking water. Russians are targeting infrastructure and industrial sites, explosions releasing tons of poisonous chemicals. They are putting oil processing plants on fire that is extremely hard to quench. From the very beginning, the war put the world on the brink of a nuclear disaster. Russian army started off by occupying Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They kept hostage the employees and didn't allow the rotation, damaged the power supply system, which is critical to safety of operations, damaged monitoring and research equipment. They built fortifications and burned grass and bushes in highly contaminated red forest. While leaving, their occupiers stole and damaged 133 radiation sources, which are highly dangerous if handled unprofessionally. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is still controlled by the Russian military. This war needs to be stopped as soon as possible, before its cost is too high for the whole humanity.
Good evening and warm greetings from Kiev. Today is the 58th day of Russian military aggression in Ukraine. It's 58 days of horror, of tears, of losses of people all over Ukraine. But it is also 58 days of bravery of Ukrainian army and volunteers, of consolidation and support, and of hopes and praise to stop this war. I would like to thank every country and every individual who helps us in fight of the Russian aggression and also provides humanitarian support to our people. Thank you very much. As nature, of course, is also suffering a lot, and nature has no borders, and it is being also raped and tortured by Russian invasion. Ukraine is a large industrialized country with thousands of industrial sites, 4 nuclear power plants, dozens of dams, and other environmentally sensitive objects. As you could hear from the video, there were more than 2,000 missiles being issued into Ukraine, as well as countless artillery shells, mines, and air bombs. And of course, all this has major damages to infrastructure, but also to the nature. Nuclear threat is one of the biggest. You've heard about Chernobyl exclusion zone, and that's a place where huge nuclear catastrophe happened in 1986. And this place also still has nuclear fuel storage facilities and other nuclear waste. And when the first day the Russian troops came into Chernobyl zone, we already fixed the 7 times increase in the radioactive pollution in the area due to the heavy machineries bringing up the dust. But actually, when the Russian troops left the place, we learned that they damaged completely the monitoring system for radioactive pollution. They stole 133 hazardous sources of radiation, and they were even digging trenches in the highly contaminated red forest. Now Chernobyl is under Ukrainian control, but Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is still under the control of Russian army. And there were also horrible events happening there. They were They burned an office building to the ground. They shelled the confinement of the first nuclear reactor, and they were also blowing up the explosive on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They still have heavy weapons, and they also mined dam of the Kakhovka reservoir nearby. So whatever intended or unintended mistake or action happens there, it can lead to huge environmental catastrophe. Of course, Ukraine is suffering from many dangerous industrial enterprises which have been hit with explosions and fires. That's oil depots causing large-scale fires, but also other places. And Russians are also using banned bombs with white phosphorus, which is heat for cities, but also for the nature. I would also like to address the issue of climate change. We still have to calculate the impacts of this war to climate change, but we expect that it will be enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions which were embedded in numerous destroyed infrastructure, military equipment and buildings, which now would have to be rebuilt. But we also expect that the war would have global impacts on climate in a bad sense, because financial resources might go to military expenditures as the world is not in peace, rather than directed to climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. There are issues of global food supply, because 1/3 of Ukrainian territory would not be able to plant agricultural products, and we are one of the major suppliers. In a good sense, we hope that many countries all over the world, including my own country, would aim to reduce dependence on fossil fuels as much as possible. And the Russian regime and this war, to a large extent, is funded with fossil fuel exports to Europe and other countries from Russia.
Thank you, Irina. My name's Carl Brook. Welcome all. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. I will be moderating today's discussion. We have an amazing panel of experts. You just heard from Irina Stavchuk, who is the Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine for European integration. Before assuming this role, she was the Deputy Minister of Energy and Environmental Protection of Ukraine. Also joining us today is Stefan Smith, who is a Senior Program Manager with the UN Environment Program, working on response to disasters and conflict. He has a background in international news agency journalism and news analysis in multiple fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Michael Botha is Professor Emeritus of Public Law at the J.W. Goethe University, Frankfurt-Main. For more than 50 years, he's been an expert in the law of war and on environmental law. Among his many posts, he was president of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. And Jose Allen is an environmental attorney with 45 years of experience in the private sector, state government, and the U.S. Department of Justice. Jose also served as a commissioner on the UN Compensation Commission, which was created in the aftermath of the 1990-91 Gulf War to require Iraq to pay reparations for damage, including environmental damage, resulting from Iraq's unlawful invasion and occupation of Kuwait. I'd like to start the discussion today by asking our experts, with all the devastation, the horrors, the heartbreak of the war in Ukraine, why are we talking about the environment? Why should we care about environmental damage? Stefan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. And good evening from Nairobi. Yeah, I think the important thing to stress really is that it's not one or the other. You know, we're not talking about humanitarian issues on the one hand and environmental issues on the other. It's one of the same thing. You know, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about livelihoods, we're talking about clean air, we're talking about clean water, safe urban areas, public health, food systems, for example. So this is all fundamentally, it's about people. It's about a safe environment in which people can live. And if we're going to be able to address the issues around the humanitarian crisis, around the refugee crisis, then that will require a robust environmental response.
Great. And Michael, you've worked on these issues for 50 years, starting with the Vietnam War. What are your perspectives on this?
Well, I entirely agree with Stefan. avoiding and repairing environmental damage means preserving the living conditions, the conditions for a bearable life during and after the conflict. There is no peace building without restoration or preservation of the environment. And in addition, the right of future generations to live in a decent environment and a healthy environment is at stake.
Thank you. Jose?
Well, Carl, I'll agree with Stefan's and Michael's comments. The only point that I would add is that concerns about environmental damage have always been present. We've always had to deal with the aftermath of war and its impact on the environment. I think the main change today has been the recognition that restoration and recovery of the environment is vital, and that compensation should be paid by the aggressor to aid those recovery efforts.
Thank you, Jose. And Irina, I don't know if you have particular perspectives to add here. You're living this.
People want to live in a peaceful country, and of course, people want to have clean water and to have all the basic clean environment, as it was already mentioned.
Excellent. So, following up on Irina's framing, we saw a wide range of environmental impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm wondering, from the panelists, are there any other environmental damages that we should be concerned about, and why?
Well, I'll start off. I mean, one of the things that we noted in the film that Irina, the deputy minister, showed was the impact of unexploded ordnance and landmines placed there. And while those might tend to be viewed through the lens of post-conflict military operations, they can also be viewed from the perspective of environmental contamination because of the long-term threat that unexploded ordnance and landmines pose to human population. The other thing that we shouldn't overlook is the issue of monitoring public health and performing medical screenings to assess and combat the increased health risks that flow from environmental damage.
So I think one of the important points you make there, Jose, is that we don't truly know what all the impacts are.
We don't know at this time, and that's going to take the process, and it emphasizes the importance of doing proper monitoring and assessment, both on an ongoing basis and post-conflict, to really understand what the full scope of impacts are.
Excellent. And Michael or Stefan, would you like to add in?
There are a few things. There are environmental damages which are, so to say, typical for any armed conflict. It's industrial pollution caused by attacks on industrial installations. Not to forget ammunition storage, which is a military objective, of course, but the environmental damages, toxic pollution caused by destroying ammunition storage are a civilian collateral damage, which has to be taken into account, and which is very serious. And another point is attacks on housing areas. Depending on the building techniques which had been used, the rubble caused by the destructions of housing is toxic waste, which causes problems. And we have seen that in a number of conflicts around the world, unfortunately. And last but not least, I would like also to draw attention to the question of loss of habitats, of loss of protected areas, which brings into the picture what I said earlier, the rights of future generations.
Thank you. And particularly I want to flag the damage to housing and other buildings, many of which have asbestos in them. So
Yes.
it's not just simply a matter of removing the rubble and starting over. You have to figure out how to manage the ongoing health threats of asbestos. There's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation about the war in Ukraine and claims of fake news. One of the first things we must do is to get a reliable assessment of the environmental impacts. Stefan, you work with the UN Environment Program, which has worked on, they've done post-conflict environmental assessments in dozens of countries going back to the Kosovo conflict in 1999. Could you maybe share with us some of the experiences and lessons from post-conflict environmental assessments? Why is it important that the UN Environment Program do such an assessment in Ukraine? And what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, I think that the first thing which is really important to stress is that there's such an enormous amount of really important work being conducted at the moment, both by Ukrainian authorities, by Ukrainian NGOs, by international civil society groups, as well as by the UN and other international governmental organizations. And I think, what we're seeing at the moment is possibly unprecedented, is that we're seeing a huge scale of remote environmental assessment and field environmental assessment at such an early stage in a conflict. And I think this comes back to a point which has been raised here as already, which is this is really perhaps a turning point in the level of attention around environment in armed conflicts. And I think that's a very positive step. I think really the key challenge in Ukraine is really going to be around how do you consolidate and prioritize this information? How do you filter it? How do you then develop targeted field assessments on remediation and mitigation? And then also, and I think this is really where UNEP can assist. I mean, this is about helping the key parties, and in particular the government of Ukraine, to have the best information possible, to make sure that they're supported in trying to collate this information and to deal with these hazards, and to really then have a solid base of information in which they can direct their efforts as well. In addition, then what we can also support on as well, and what we will be supporting on is actual field assessments themselves, laboratory analysis, for example, the provision of specific technical expertise. For example, it's already been mentioned, the complexity of dealing with asbestos in urban waste, and also remote sensing and satellite imaging as well.
Thank you. And Stefan, you alluded to a number of organizations that are doing this sort of assessment. I'm wondering if the other panelists might be able to speak to the role of these other organizations in assessing environmental damage both during and after conflict. Michael, would you like to start?
Yes, indeed. Following up on what Stefan said, there are two aspects relating to fact-finding concerning environmental damages. The first question is who did what? Who pulled the trigger? Which then also relates to criminal law. And the other thing is, the other aspect is, what is the environmental impact? Where is the environmental problem? How can we evaluate environmental damage? So the effect, and both aspects are important. And we need fact-finding on both aspects. Now, coming to the practice, Stefan already mentioned a very important point. And this is civil society organizations who are doing fact-finding, mainly on their own initiative. In relation to the Ukraine conflict, we've had such fact-finding in the Donbas area, where since 2014, the environment is heavily damaged. And I admire some of those activists who did fact-finding at the risk of their life. So I think this is a very important point. The NGOs, civil society organizations, acting on their own initiative. But on the other hand, there are governmental organizations, and Stefan represents one of them, perhaps the most important one, but there are others. When we get closer to the humanitarian aspect, it's the United Nations Human Rights Council or the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs. We have already in place a mission by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE was just submitted. I have read recently a report. There's a 3-person commission. I have not yet seen that report, but this is an important aspect. So there is a diversity of organizations which are involved, and I think there is no point of centralization. Different organizations have different potentials, and they should all go ahead. This brings me to a last point, because you mentioned my former capacity as chair of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. That is an institution set up by the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. So there's a treaty-based body which has the task, if asked by the parties, to inquire any violation of international humanitarian law, and that, of course, includes causing environmental damage which is unlawful under international humanitarian law. That commission, I'm no longer part of it, but I know it, has offered its services to the parties to the conflict. So far, I haven't heard of any reactions to this offer.
Thank you, Michael. And Jose, would you like to share some of your experiences from the UNCC?
Sure. Certainly, as a commissioner with the UNCC in evaluating claims for environmental damage resulting from the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, one of the central issues that we needed to grapple with was the question of the baseline. What was the baseline prior to the environmental damage that was caused by the conflict? And in that context, the importance of having good monitoring and assessment, being able to measure the increment of damage and be able to prove that increment of damage becomes very, very important to any compensation that might be provided for that damage. For some areas, it's going to be obvious that the change in baseline that occurred. You have an urban area with apartment buildings, office buildings, and now it's been reduced to rubble. It becomes more difficult when you're dealing with areas that have been previously heavily industrialized, perhaps contaminated from those prior historical industrial activities, and there it becomes more challenging to establish the baseline and evaluate the increment of damage, but it's no less important to do.
Thank you, Jose. And that's a great segue to the next question, which is shifting gears from impacts to action. And the question is, what can be done about the environmental impacts? I think there are two broad categories. One is environmental remediation and containing the damage, and then restoration, and then questions of liability. And I'd like to focus first on the containment and remediation of environmental damage. Stefan, UNEP has, for now more than 2 decades, worked to restore the environment in conflict-affected countries. Based on your experience, what are the priorities for environmental recovery in Ukraine, and what are the typical patterns of post-war environmental reconstruction that we tend to see?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer because we're still in what is an active conflict at the moment, and it's a continuing conflict. So at this stage, it's difficult to kind of identify any specific priorities. At the same time as well, is that what we've seen is, as has been mentioned, a heavily industrialized society, which has undergone sustained heavy attacks. We've seen significant urban damage. There's a significant problem with unexploded ordnance, damage to industrial facilities, chemical storage facilities, extractive sites, deforestation, impacts on agricultural land. And I think all of this, we've seen a large scope of various themes, in perhaps components of themes that we've seen in other places all around the world, but perhaps all wrapped into one country, and with quite a challenging and large geographical scope as well. So I think one of the issues, rather than at this stage talking about priorities, is to really highlight the extensive scope of damage and the extensive geographical scope of the damage that has taken place. I think in terms of priorities, I think obviously it's maintaining a very robust monitoring process from all of these partners, making sure that assessments are done quickly, accurately, and of high quality. And this is really the priority of this has to make sure that any recovery efforts, and even when thinking forward to reconstruction and redevelopment planning, is to make sure that this is founded on solid baselines and accurate baselines as well, so that the reconstruction efforts don't actually exacerbate some of the environmental problems. And I think this has been the case in many conflicts before, is that environmental recovery work or hazard remediation tends to be a little bit quick and dirty to some extent. The environmentalists tend to come into the show perhaps a little bit late, and then it goes back to business as usual, which is very carbon intensive and very destructive as well.
Thank you. Jose, would you like to share a few perspectives from the UNCC experience?
Certainly. I think that for the international community, a focus on providing financial support for monitoring and assessment and restoration efforts are as important as providing financial support for economic recovery or infrastructure rebuilding. And that needs to be part of any international effort that is made, is to ensure that there's adequate funding. I mean, one of the issues that we faced with the UNCC is the question of providing early funding so that affected governments did have the capability of carrying out the monitoring assessment, because if you're going to make a claim for compensation and you don't have the ability to establish the nature of the damage and extent of damage that you've suffered, your claim is probably not going to proceed or succeed. So you have to make sure that the funding is there to enable the affected entities to undertake the necessary assessment and ultimately the remediation that becomes necessary afterwards.
Great points. And I'd like to shift now to the question of accountability. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how it's undertaken the war have generated widespread agreement that Russia has violated numerous provisions of international law. The challenge, though, is how to hold Russia and the relevant leaders accountable. Usual mechanisms such as the UN Security Council, which was instrumental in holding Iraq liable for environmental and other damage arising from the 1990-91 invasion of Kuwait, are problematic because Russia holds a veto power. So, to the panel, what can countries in the international community do to hold Russia and its leaders civilly or criminally accountable for the environmental harms associated with this invasion? Michael, would you like to start?
Well, this is a great field. I'll try to describe the various aspects, one over the other. Let me start with criminal responsibility of individuals involved in the commission of crimes. The essential crime that has to be said in the beginning is attacks on the civilian population, which can be targeting civilians in the first place, which is a war crime, or by attacking military objectives causing disproportionate damage to the civilian population, And both aspects involve protection of the environment. The environment is essentially civilian, and damaging the environment in this context is a war crime for that reason. Now, coming to war crimes, we first think, and that has already been mentioned, of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction on war crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, regardless of the fact that Russia is not a party to the ICC statute. This is different as regards the crime of aggression, which would involve a duty to pay damages for anything which follows, but this crime of aggression requires that the state of the perpetrator is a party to the conflict. Now, the International Criminal Court has started an investigation concerning the situation, but the second very difficult problem is to single out specific suspects, which is also a question of fact-finding, and I understand the organizations doing fact-finding are aware of this problem, and from time to time one reads information that this is going on. The ICC is not the only institution which is entitled to prosecute war crimes. On the basis of universal jurisdiction, any state is entitled to do that. And I know that in a number of states, not only in the state of the victim, Ukraine, of course, but also in a number of states, and this includes Germany and Switzerland, there are investigations going on. Wherever this ends is difficult to know, but if I could give advice to Russian officers, be careful where you travel. You may be caught in a state which has an attentive prosecution. Now, turning to the question of reparation of damages. This is difficult as there is no international court which has jurisdiction on the matter. There is, of course, one precedent, which is the US-Iranian Claims Tribunal, which had the task of sorting out the consequences of the hostage-taking case. This requires an agreement, but I think it's not entirely unrealistic, because after a while both parties might find an interest in clarifying the consequences of this war, including the consequences of sanctions on one side or
Michael,
the other.
Michael, we're running a little short on time.
Yes, sure.
Wondering if I'd like to shift for a moment on the civil liability to Jose and his experiences with the UNCC.
Well, certainly. Look. The critical issue is, where's the money going to come from? It's one thing to assert and to establish that the aggressor is liable for damages. The other question is well, how are you going to get access? I do think, given the issues that you pointed out, Carl, with trying to establish some kind of international tribunal now, similar to the UNCC, I think the use of foreign assets that are held by national governments provides a mechanism for there to be a fund available to pay compensation. To my mind, though, the critical thing is that whatever form any tribunal takes, it needs to be one that is efficient, speedy, and fair. We don't know what that's going to look like at the end, but it seems to me that those are the key features that have to be in place. The Iranian Claims Tribunal, while important, became very protracted and is still very protracted because of the elaborate procedures that were involved. So I think looking forward, we need to make sure that whatever we do can operate efficiently and quickly and get compensation to the victims and affected governments as quickly as possible.
Michael, do you want to have a quick rebuttal or follow on, particularly as it relates to frozen assets?
I entirely agree that the money is there, but access to that money poses some questions of sovereign immunity, because this is state money. And normally this is protected by the rule of state immunity. Now, there are recent developments that's worthwhile inquiring into that in this case, where the consequences of a violation of fundamental norms of international law are at stake, it is possible to argue that in this case, the duty of states to put an end to a violation of imperative norms of international law takes precedence over the traditional rule of state immunity. But there is a legal fight which has to be fought.
Thank you. And Irina, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on what the Ukrainian government is thinking about or doing in this area, criminally or civilly.
So Ukrainian government in a civic law is collecting all the information and recording all the cases to be able to put it in the International Court of Justice. In terms of environmental damage, that's, as I learned today, also many more information, and thank you for sharing these ideas, but we also have challenges in understanding how to assess what kind of methodologies use. We have challenges to quickly assess some sites because the war is ongoing and it's not always that we have access to the places. But we also see that the scale of impacts in Ukraine and the international legal system in place doesn't really fit. So we have to work together to find out new legal developments to be able to resolve this also for the hopefully not existing future cases, but also that Ukraine becomes precedent of bringing environmental damages, like making aggressor accountable also for environmental damages. And very much looking forward to cooperate with all of the international organizations, scientific organizations, legal organizations to help us on this process.
I'd like to close by asking each of you in one sentence, a short sentence, what should be the priorities of Ukraine and the international community in addressing environmental damage caused by Russia's invasion? Stefan.
Okay, so I'll try and be quick. I think, look, the scale of the destruction that we're seeing is so big, and that in itself presents a challenge of perhaps almost dealing with a blank slate. And I think the overall message is that I think everybody needs to think big. The political will for positive recovery is clearly there in Ukraine. There is a requirement to support that. We need to think beyond just making Ukraine safe again and just really start to think big. Imagine the national, the regional, the global potential of a green economic recovery.
That was a long sentence. Well done. Michael, you.
Well, credible and reliable fact-finding will be key. Second sentence, there is a task for the international community at large, a duty of solidarity, providing help, which means finance and expertise, which is there around the world and should concentrate on restoring the environment of Ukraine.
Thank you. Jose.
I have a very short sentence. I echo Stefan's and Michael's comments. I think those are the key priorities that we need to focus on. Two sentences, sorry.
Irina?
Ukrainian people, and it was also stated by the president and by the government of Ukraine, we want to have the green recovery, to build it on the low carbon and green technologies. So we would very much appreciate cooperation on expertise and on financial support to make it possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for sharing your expertise today. This is a critically important issue from Ukraine to Yemen to Colombia to Myanmar and many other countries. I thank those who are watching the show for taking time to be with us here today. And Washington, back to you.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you to our speakers for having this conversation. Irina, please stay safe. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with our global audience today. Much appreciated. And thank you to Kathleen Rogers and EarthDay.org for co-hosting today's DC program with us. Moving on, we are going to now turn from the impacts of war to the impacts of agriculture on our planet's health.
So, welcome to We Don't Have Time TV, and welcome to a broadcast on the environment of Ukraine, close to 2 years after the start of a conflict that began in February 2022. In many ways, this is a follow-up to a similar broadcast that we undertook in April 2022, where in partnership with the Earth Day Network, we brought together the Ukraine government and independent experts during the early days of this war. Today, we will hear at first hand how the environment and the environmental services of Ukraine are right now, present perhaps more detailed findings from ongoing assessments, while also looking into next steps needed to restore the health of Ukraine for its people. Before we start, let me ask the audience to download the We Don't Have Time app, which you can do at wedon'thavetime.org, and then you can interact with our wonderful guests and also post comments and generally engage. So let me first introduce, and I'm delighted to introduce, Victoria Kiryeva, Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources. Deputy Minister, thank you very much for finding the time to be with us. If you could give perhaps your perspective on the state of the country's environment and what is perhaps needed going forward. Over to you.
Dear colleagues, I want to thank the organizers and participants of this roundtable for addressing the important issue of the environmental impact of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In the face of the climate crisis, we must remain committed to creating a better, safer world for future generations. Russia's war in Ukraine is not only illegal, but also harming our environmental and hindering global efforts to combat climate change. Ukraine, with the support of international partners, is actively working to address these challenges while adhering to international commitments like the Paris Agreement. We have introduced the International Environmental Declaration to provide solutions for countries affected by conflict based on Ukrainians' experience. The declaration will strengthen the global platform for emissions environmental damage from military actions, an initiative announced by President Volodymyr Zelensky to COP27. The global platform aims to standardize approaches for evaluating the environmental and climate impacts of armed conflicts. Our proposal is to create shared tools for assessing environmental damage and holding aggressors accountable. We invite support for an international environmental declaration from all countries. We must recognize that war is not only costly in terms of life and money, but also its environmental impact. Let's stand together for justice and nature. Thank you for your dedication to making the world a better place. Slava Ukraini.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Minister. Let me bring in here Oleksii Ryabchin, who's energy and climate expert and a member of Ukraine's delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, who is also here at COP28, which is wonderful. Oleksii, one of your areas of interest, I understand, is the issue of infrastructure Can you frame the impact of the conflict on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, for example, or the climate goals generally?
Yes, Nick, while we are here, like the Russia is constantly attacking Ukraine's infrastructure, like both civilian and like economic. We have huge impact on like people's houses, on agriculture, on port, and of course on the forest, nature, and energy objects, which are suffering the most. And now it's winter time, and we anticipate another massive attack on our energy infrastructure. During the previous one, like Russian drones attacked the generation object and transmission object, which affected even some blackouts in Ukraine. And we in Kiev were like for like 2, 3, or like 6 hours without the electricity. But honestly saying, like when you sit in a, in a capital, and it's not a big problem, like even if it's cold, like to sit like without the electricity, we do trust in our like serviceman who is able to repair it. But in the region, especially the war-torn, where the fights are, when you think about the soldiers who are sitting in the trenches, in the cold trenches, in the rainy trenches, like without like any kind of like civilization measures, like you're able to tolerate your 2 or 3 hours sitting without electricity. But nevertheless, like Ukrainians are like very optimistic people, and we do believe that the destroyed infrastructure will be rebuilt using the Build Back Better approach. It will give us an opportunity during the process of integrating into European Union to rebuild our country according to the best available standards, which will definitely be positive toward the climate change. But as the previous speaker said, as Deputy Minister Victoria Kiyeva said, we need to make Russia accountable. Because Russia has a huge amount of assets frozen in different capitals of the world, and these are the money that the aggressor needs to pay to compensate the damage to the nature, damage to climate, and damage to the infrastructure.
Let me just ask you one quick question here. I mean, I understand that the Ukraine was actually, I understand that Ukraine was in many ways doing some amazing things with renewable energy. I think you'd had a policy on fossil fuel subsidies, for example, which was some people, dream of the world phasing out fossil fuel subsidies because, of course, they cost at the minimum $1 trillion right now, and maybe 7 trillion right now, according to the IMF, if you actually include the damage that the fossil fuel subsidies do in terms of extreme weather events and stuff like that. So Ukraine had been on a pathway to more renewable energy, I think. Has that been lost momentarily with the conflict?
Unfortunately, a huge amount of our generation, green generation, renewable generation, has now been occupied because it was located in the south of Ukraine. But nevertheless, like even with this, with the war, like we opened a new like 200 megawatt wind turbine station in the occupied Nikolaev region. So we show that like Ukraine is doing some of the reforms even during the war. Like we see the huge interest to the biomethane project in Ukraine, and Ukraine, which has like one of the big soils in the world, are able to not only to use this biomethane internally, but also to help greening the European continent and to supply this biomethane to different countries. And these are the means of our decarbonization. So we are not only rely on international support, we are able to carbonize with the investments and to make business with the whole world.
Okay, good. Let's now go over to, and we can continue this debate later on when we have a good chat, because I think it's a very interesting topic. Let me then return to Olesya Petrovich, who's an expert on biodiversity protection. She's with the Reform Support Team at the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. Yeah, you have the floor. What is happening with the biodiversity and how is that going?
Yeah, Yes, of course. So, war is one of the most dramatic anthropogenic factors impacting nature, directly and indirectly. In most cases, unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally destroying natural habitats. And common consequences of hostilities, shelling, mining, and movement of heavy military vehicles, arrangement of army staging grounds, and other military activities include destruction of soil cover, fire of forest and other vegetation, water body pollutions, etc. So we are observing the death of many animals, birds, fish, and other organisms in the war zone as a result of direct killing, destruction of their habitats, or destruction of different type of infrastructure. For example, like dam, it caused sudden flooding in the lower part of the river and draining of former reservoirs, and animals dying because of various occasional traps, poaching, and even very loud noise. So actually, the war destroying our life supporting system, I think. The war caused a significant impact on the environment in general and on the most ecologically important areas in particular. Despite on the fact that many of our protected areas was protected not only by Ukrainian legislation, but also international agreements signed by Russia too. So circa 1,500 protected areas with a total area of more than 3 million hectares were in zone of military tactics and in the areas occupied by Russia since 2014. And almost 900 protected areas still situated on the front line or in the region occupied by Russian troops. Among them, 170 Emerald Network sites protected by Berne Convention, 16 wetlands of international importance protected by Russian Ramsar Convention, and 3 UNESCO biosphere reserves, and also 2 nature strict reserves and 15 national nature parks. These protected areas are losing their quality each day. And nature conservation organizations like parks and reserves also losing their properties, equipment, infrastructure, and ability to work and protect nature. The scale of such destructions increases with time and intensity of military activities and should be investigated case by case after the end of the war. And since February 22, most of protected areas in zone of military activities stopped field work, but tried to continue to do at least administrative or scientific or educational work in remote form. The exception is Ascania Nova Biosphere Reserve, whose staff continued to work in full scale during 1 year of the war till the establishment of new occupational administration of the reserve. So currently we see an understanding of value of nature and need to restore it. And despite of the war ministry and NGOs and international organizations have already started to active work on systematic change to, for example, national legislation, management approaches, or also intensifying scientific research in that direction. And this how we work on preparation of national biodiversity strategy and other laws where it is prescribed that is significant efforts, significant part of our work should be dedicated to the restoration of nature, the mining of parks and reserves, and introduction of new nature conservation methods, but also improvement of international nature conservation legislation, mainly through implementing strict principles on how to protect environment during armed conflicts, probably on the UN level, and integration of such things into multilateral environmental agreements will help to prevent similar scale tragedy from taking place in the future.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And we'll come back to you. Please stay with the show. Let's now go to Olena Maslikiwska, Associate Professor, Department of Environmental Studies at the National University of Kyiv Mola Academy. Have I got that right? If I got that wrong, you just clear that up for me.
Kyiv Mohila Academy.
Fantastic. All right. So we know that one piece of infrastructure that hit the headlines in June this year was the devastating collapse of the Kakhovka Dam that caused massive flooding along the Dnieper River. What is the situation today on that, and what have been the environmental consequences?
You're right. The destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant is the biggest environmental catastrophe in Ukraine after the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. It has resulted in the loss of 350 megawatts of hydro generation capacity in the region. But even more, this terrorist attack by the Russians caused catastrophic flooding and loss of Kakhovka reservoir, which before the destruction contained 18 million of cubic meters of water. This is the volume of the Caspian Sea or the Yellow River in China. So 72% of this water has been lost. So the massive flooding killed many animals and damaged farmlands, homes, businesses, and infrastructure. An estimated total direct cost only to the environment is 5.85 billion euro. We are talking about 64,000 hectares of forest, which is the size of Latvia. We are talking about 150 hectares of natural protected areas, which is the size of Nepal. And many of these protected areas have international importance. They are part of the Emerald Network or are the wetlands of international importance. It was assessed that about 160,000 of birds have died, 20,000 of animals, and actually some 300 animals in the local zoo just drowned. After the water was gone, the Kakhovka reservoir was covered by 95,000 tons of dead fish. You can only imagine what a catastrophic mass-scale pollution has been caused, because essentially water has washed away pesticides, wastewater, oil, heavy metals, which were stored on the bottom of the reservoir, minefields, essentially transforming the Odessa and Mykolaiv regions into garbage dumps and animal cemeteries.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to say that there is a huge drinking water shortage because of 1 million people only in one Dnipropetrovsk Oblast are expected to face water shortages. Even more, the collapse of the dam reduced the volume of water available to the North Crimean Canal, which is the main source of fresh water to the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula.
Mm.
And of course, this terrorist attack has an international impact because Kakhovka Reservoir was important for agriculture. 1 million hectares of land in 3 most productive southern oblasts in Ukraine will be unusable for the next 3 to 5 years because of the lack of water. And it could result in food shortages on world markets and potentially famine in poor countries that rely on Ukraine grain export. We have to understand that farmland in the south will dry up and the reclamation systems will be damaged. And the flood water essentially washed away the top soil layer from thousands of hectares of farm and arable land, and it will require years to recover. So to sum up, the effect is catastrophic, but we still need assessment. We need more assessment from specialists from around the world, which would help to not only to assess the consequences, but also to predict how it will impact in the long run, not only Ukraine, but the world.
Thank you. Let's come back on that in the chat afterwards, because yes, what one does in going forward with the dam, whether to rebuild the dam or whether to think of alternatives, is now some of the choices that are unfolding. So let's stay with that. Super. Let's go over now to Leonard de Klerk from the Initiative on the GHG, Greenhouse Gas Accounting of War. Leonard, you've been crunching the numbers on the growth in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of this conflict, a very relevant topic, of course, for COP28. Can you give us a bit of a glimpse into the numbers?
Yes, thank you, Nick, for the introduction. Indeed, we've been looking from the start of this full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we've been looking at the emissions that can be attributed to this act of aggression. And the numbers are actually quite big. I mean, during this COP28, we're releasing our third assessment, which covers the first or the 18 months of war, and the total emissions. The total additional emissions of this war is around 150 million tons of CO2. And that's quite big, because this is comparable to, well, it's even bigger than the annual emissions of a highly industrialized country like Belgium. So, and you should understand, we're talking about additional emissions, extra emissions, whereas we're all talking and we're all convening here at COP28 to make sure that the emissions are going down and to avoid catastrophic climate change. It should go down rapidly, but this war caused by Russia only increases emissions. And actually, it's not only the military and the warfare itself that causes significant emissions, but it's also the fires in forests, agricultural land, and in the build-up area. We've also seen emissions from the refugee crisis, although that's relatively small. But the big chunk of emissions will happen in the future for the reconstruction of the country. I mean, we've seen massive destruction of buildings, hospitals, roads, other infrastructure, and Kakhovka Dam is a big event and a big example. And the reconstruction will need a lot of building materials. We're talking about cement, and we're talking about steel, and they're very carbon intensive. Now, these 150 million tons of additional emissions is, in monetary terms, almost $10 billion in damage. And we believe that Russia should be held accountable for the damage they're doing, not only to Ukraine but to the world community, because emissions they don't know borders. It doesn't matter where they happen on the world, but these emissions caused by Russia could cause climate damage at in some countries like Pakistan or in southern America. So at the same time, I do see an opportunity also for undoing the damage of Russia. And actually, that's what Ukraine can do by replanting the trees that have been burned, but also make sure that the reconstruction of the country is green. And in our first estimations, we've already concluded that if the right incentives are being put in place, and of course Russia has to pay up, that these reconstruction emissions can be reduced by 30 to 40%. So that's a
let's
positive.
pause down that and come back on that. So, last but not least, let me welcome Roman Shachmatenko, the team leader of the UN Development Programme's Energy and Environment Portfolio in Ukraine. Roman, you're with this new center that's been established with some funding from the Swedish International Development Agency. What are you hoping to achieve with this new center?
Hi, Nick. Hi, colleagues. First of all, I'm very happy to see you today, and very great that we have this opportunity to talk about those very important questions, actually. But just before I start answering your question, if you don't mind, can I have a couple of comments on the previous issues, such as energy damage assessment, Kakhovka?
Yeah, sure. Not too long, because you can also bring it out in the chat that we'll come to afterwards. But yeah, fire away.
Just very briefly, I would like to make some points that are actually very interconnected with what you're asking about as well. So adding up on what Alexei said about the what happened to the energy system and what's going on with the renewables, I would like to say that last year, UNDP, together with the World Bank on the first iteration, second iteration, UNDP only, provided a very extensive energy damage assessment report. So basically, according to this report, more than a half of generation capacities have been destroyed for 2022-23. More than 60% of maneuvering capacities were destroyed, and that was 60% before Kakhovka Dam, because Kakhovka Dam was not only the source of generation capacities, but a unique maneuvering capacity.
What do you mean by maneuvering capacity, just for the audience?
Maneuvering something is your instrument for the energy system to cover the peaks and downs of the energy consumption. So basically, So if you don't have those, you're very much you're very much inefficient system. So each energy system require those a lot. So 60% plus destroyed. Transmission capacities were something that Russians targeted from the first day. And due to the situation that Ukrainian energy system was built as a Soviet kind of a system, very much centralized. So basically, if you hit one point, you're able to, to hinder a big chunk of the system. So therefore, the transmission capacities were down more than half as well. But this brings to another very much important point. The TPPs fired by coal, which are also the source of highly maneuvering capacities as well, were also destroyed, mainly destroyed. And currently, although the government is trying to restore some of them, it is a question whether it will be, basically, because the coal access, the access to the coal is hindered. Why I'm saying about the coal, because now, taking into account that basically there's not much choice, Ukraine has to proceed with a coal phase out. That's my opinion, that it is quite obvious that Ukraine will have to proceed with a coal phase out and search for more sustainable solutions, including the maneuvering capacities. But not only that Ukraine has to do that, but you have to decentralize your system so you don't have that problem.
So Roman, I'm going to have to stop you a little bit there, because I think we can start bringing in people as more a debate here, right? Because I think you set out some very good points there. And so maybe we can just bring everybody in here, and maybe I can frame it this way. So, I mean, it's clear there's been huge amounts of damage, huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. The hitting of that dam has consequences which are still being understood, but some are already quite clear. Obviously, biodiversity, I mean, sometimes people in the middle of conflict forget that, we actually do need our biodiversity. We do need all these. These are part of the resilience also of agriculture. When you're building back better, you need your pollinators, you need, and so on and so forth. So these are the resources of a nation that need to be taken into account. And then, of course, there's the issue of the greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure that for many people watching this show, they're thinking, how can they be talking about all this when there's still conflict going on in the East? And but the fact is, we need to look to the future and a better future. And what do we do? So I'm really picking up on first on this issue of the dam. Olena, when we talked before this show, and I think some other people were part of that conversation, there are these interesting choices emerging right now that one could build back the dam as it is, a hydroelectric dam, fantastic, or is there a possibility of a completely different vision? In other words, the land there could support, say, renewable energy, for example, maybe less land for the same number of gigawatts, right, or megawatts. What's the discussion that's going on there? Try and illuminate it for the audience.
Yes, you're correct. There is a number of clashes in opinions what to do from now on. Indeed, the government said that there is a need to rebuild the dam because of the various services that the dam provided to agriculture, industry, drinking water. On the other hand, many environmentalists, but also people of culture and historians say that we cannot allow to build dam and flood the territory, which is historically and environmentally important to the country. And, in order to provide this 350 megabytes of lost electricity, we can build, renewables. But also there's a third opinion that we should find kind of a compromise of the two. Build a dam somewhere else, leaving part of the territory to nature and people, and the other will be again flooded. But again, these are just speculations unless we have very thorough research of the environmental consequences of each scenario, including value of ecosystem services provided by either the Kakhovka Dam or by the current ecosystems which are evolving.
Does anybody want to come here? I mean, I don't know what the capacity of the Ukraine is for actually, completely transforming itself into a renewable energy superpower. But obviously it's a big country. Infrastructure has been damaged, building back better. The world knows we need to get off coal. Coal needs to go first, and then actually also oil needs to go now as well. But anyway, it's a complicated story, yeah. But what anyone want to comment on this building back better with a renewable energy future?
I like with a great pleasure. So I would say even right now, we can say about the renewable energy, but we have now, if we're speaking about low carbon, if we bring the nuclear here, which is I know that's controversial, but with the nuclear and renewable and hydropower, we have even now during the war, more than 60-75% of the electricity mix, which is low carbon, which is basically, I would say, better for the majority of the EU member states. So the alliances that Ukraine is willing to join. Of course, we still heavily relying on oil, on the gasoline, but even though we have more EVs than lots of our Western neighbors, and we have a huge amount of chargers, and the EVs market is really booming right now. We have more than 70,000 EVs in Ukraine. We are the country who uses a lot heating system. So we are the country with a very strong winter. So we will still rely on gas. But the coal will be phased out in 2035, according to the governmental plan. It's really, it's really hard. It's really unreliable. And we spoke already in the beginning about the subsidies. So it's heavily subsidized. It's not profitable. So we will cut off our coal-fired generation, and we are able to use the infrastructure of this coal plant because there is grid, there are transformers there, so we can transform them into a new object. And what is more interesting, if we will bring Chernobyl disaster here, so the land of Chernobyl is also planning by the government to use at the renewable hub. So there are infrastructure there from Chernobyl, so grid and a lot of transformers, and we are able to do the investment project. And I think it's not a classified secret. We already doing something even right now, even during the war there. So answering your question, yes, Ukraine will be the renewable and green hub, a power bank of Europe and of the world.
Leonard, any thoughts on this? I mean, do you think there's a great potential for renewables there in Ukraine?
No, definitely there is a huge potential. And I think it's also important to realize that, if even at grassroots level in Ukraine, at least when I'm talking to Ukrainians, they realize that fossil fuel is the unreliable source of energy. Because if they keep on using fossil fuel, they are vulnerable. So I think you very easily, if you approach it from a security of energy supply, then you really hit a chord with the Ukrainians. So with all these aspects all together, renewable becoming cheaper, Ukrainians themselves want to get rid of fossil fuel, it's just a matter of time.
I think it's important, Leonard, to note that it's not just Ukraine that is vulnerable in terms of fossil fuel supplies. The rest of Europe seemed to be suddenly in chaos. So this notion of energy independence glimpsed through the lens of renewable energy and storage. Maybe that's where the dam story comes in. It could store a lot as well. Is really there. Yeah. We've kind of the biodiversity story. Just so we can get back on that with our two other wonderful guests. Are there any plans? I mean, one of the big debates at COP28 and also at COP27 was, can we move food systems to a more regenerative food systems, which of course is good for human health in terms of food, but also a lot of farmers find that they can get off, pesticides or not use as many pesticides. And at the same time, you reduce climate greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, Ukraine being a massive breadbasket and a farming country, is there a way of building back better with the agriculture as well to benefit biodiversity and farmers, if I can put it that way? Anybody want to comment?
I can comment if nobody.
What about our two ladies here? Yeah. I mean, they're important too. So men can't take over the world. We have to. It has to be balanced now.
That may be Alessia could step in.
Alessia, can you come in on that?
Agriculture is responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emission in Ukraine, and the main sources are the loss of soil organic carbon by croplands and also nitrogen oxide emissions. So that high productivity of Ukrainian soils and agriculture actually expanse of Ukrainian nature. Arable lands cover almost 60% of Ukraine, and that show negative trend, and it's reducing biodiversity of Ukraine at all. But also during last 2 years, we investigate interesting topic about nature-based solutions and how they can be implemented in Ukrainian agriculture, and we discovered that our agriculture, our soil can store carbon dioxide, can catch it and be profitable not only by money, by crops, but also by catching carbon. If we will implement all of the possible nature-based solution in agriculture, for example, it can be different type of agroecology practices or also green infrastructure in between the fields. It can help us to achieve carbon neutrality of agriculture in Ukraine.
Leonard, do you want to comment?
Yeah, no, talking about, agriculture, Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse, exporting a lot of food, feeding, many parts of the world. But also, if we look into the reconstruction of Ukraine, I do see an enormous potential for Ukraine here as well. Because we all want to move away from cement and steel. I mean, this is a movement that we see now in whole of Europe. And we want to move to bio-based building materials. Because the beauty of bio-based building materials is when they, grow, they take out the carbon from the atmosphere and you basically store it in a building. And just to give you an example, the production of hemp, is a very fast-growing crop, and it can be used to insulate buildings, for example. Mm-hmm. So, if Ukraine not only starts to grow these bio-based building materials for its own reconstruction, but also start exporting this to Europe, you would have an enormous, benefit to the climate, because we're basically taking out the CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in buildings.
We could have a much longer conversation here, but I mean, it's really fascinating to hear about, in a sense, the confidence and the optimism that and the plans, and obviously more assessments are needed for in some areas for the final decisions, but all these choices that could happen in a post-conflict setting.
Despite the fact that we are witnessing so much destruction of our natural ecosystems, our agriculture and industry, we are all hopeful that this is a perfect opportunity to get rid of all the Soviet legacy, the heavy industry, the very extensive agriculture. And now it's just reinvent everything, starting from our mindsets. What is agriculture for us? What are forests for us? What kind of zoning even we would like to have? But this requires a lot of discussions. We have to build this common societal consensus. And we do require support of the best creative scientific minds of the world who would like to test their approaches and offer their support. So we really call for help to reinvent our energy systems, our agriculture, our forestry, like everything that we have, because we have so much energy that we would like to put into it. And not even reinvent, we do have brilliant minds, but the scale of the destruction is so massive that we really would like to have some help on that.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us, and we wish you all the best of luck. And yeah, I think so many people around the world are looking at what is happening in Ukraine, and I think it's refreshing to hear that there is so much thinking, planning, action, and optimism towards building back better for a different kind of future. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick. Have a good one. Have a good day.
Thank you.